Welcome back, David. Gonna dig into a big topic, uh, which we come across is testing, blood testing, tolerance testing, any kind of testings that a lot of people do. More often than not, they don't do good enough job, and on some occasions, they just come in with massive overkill and present us with hundreds of different test results, which make no sense whatsoever to even do before you get anywhere. What is the truth? What I'm looking for is when too much is too much and when just enough is nowhere near enough.
Yeah. So a couple things, right? This is piggybacking off our previous video, the one right before this, which is the concept that everything changes depending on your environment, internal environment, and that's going to change by the season. It's going to change by the age, and it's going to change by the gender, right? So knowing that the individual has its own microenvironment, that's what I'm going to kind of default to calling it, right? Your body has its own microenvironment that's happening and shifting by time of day, by season, and by age. Then you have the macro environment, which is your living circumstances, your home, your city, where that is on the planet, right? And that's the macro environment. Those two dictate how your body's going to function and the reaction your body's going to have to all inputs. This includes food, it includes peptides, it includes hormones. Anything you put in your body, it's going to react differently depending on the combination of your external environment and your internal environment. That's concept number one. Once you understand that concept, then you can quickly start to take some type of testing and give it a hierarchy, right? So point being is we want to know at the internal level what your mitochondria and your cells are doing, right? And mitochondria have three inputs, right? They have electrons, that's going to be coming from food and being influenced by electromagnetic fields. It has oxygen. It's going to require that in order to oxidize fats, right? Fatty acid oxidation. That's the TCA cycle. It does not function without oxygen being delivered correctly. And that's going to have to do with what carries the oxygen. That's your red blood cells. That's all of that type of stuff, right? And then you have global interactions. And what I mean by that is hormonal states and neurological states, right? And we're going to see that with water networks and thyroid and sex hormones and precursors to sex hormones like DHEA and vitamin D, right? So prohormones. When you get a grasp of those, you can get a pretty clear picture of the internal environment, right? And I'll go into a little bit more detail on a sample report of like what values tell us what, right? But that's concept number one.
And you already lined up some things that majority of people will never even consider for optimal health, so to speak. So if they go to their general practitioner to check health, it's usually, if you're lucky, blood pressure. If you're not, just cholesterol. And for men, sometimes testosterone. That's it.
Yeah.
So a very subpar approach.
Your normal yearly checkup that you go to your physician for, it's basically going to be those two things. You're going to get some cholesterol numbers, right? And you're going to get maybe testosterone if you're a man. If you're a female, you might get TSH, right, for thyroid. But you and I know, but just TSH is it's bullcrap, right? So we'll talk
and it's
about
really hard to, like, for example, in Europe, well, in UK specifically, reverse T is very kind of complex thing to figure out.
They don't do that very often.
Yeah, you need to go and specifically like, we need this. Like, you need it.
Interesting. Yeah. So we'll talk about that as far as like availability. It's very easy in the US to get the ones. But if you're out of the US, you can ask for these, right? And I deal with people who live in Scandinavian countries and stuff like that. And
in my country, you can book a blood test and get results in 2 hours.
Right. You just got to know what
that's how fast it is. You go in, and within 2 hours they send it to your email.
Yeah. So we'll talk about that. Now, that's the blood test. We'll talk about the specifics of the blood test, but that's what we want to know. We want to know, hey, the internal environment of this person, how are they functioning? It tells you a little bit of mitochondria, it tells you about sex hormone production, prohormone production, resiliency, water networks, stuff like that. There's a lot of details there, and we'll go to there next as far as like detailed looking into. But then the next step below that, right, is we want to know the external environment. And most people, this is where most people get frivolous information, right? Most people will either use like a food intolerance test or their Whoop band or some other, there's all kinds of like, you put your hand in this device and it looks at the toxins in your body and it spits out some weird, there's all kinds of things like that, right? And what those tests are doing is something unique that can be useful if you're detailed enough. And this is what I mean by it. Those tests all will change depending on the environment, the external environment, right? So, for example, a food intolerance test, I think you had an example of that. You can send the same
I
sample.
had personal experience. I was given food intolerance tests and like, oh, give it to one of your clients, give it to yourself. I sent my own sample in two different bags, and the results came back completely different. And I'm like, thank you, no, thank you.
Right. And the reason for that is those types of tests change where the test was, the time of day the test was completed, the lighting environment of the test, the temperature of the test samples will change those types of tests, the intolerance testing and all of those types of tests where they're looking at something from you. It can be hair, it can be skin, it can be a saliva thing, right? It's a sample from you, and then they're interpreting it through an algorithm, because that's what it is. It's not a direct measurement. It's an algorithm. And then it spits out some kind of intolerance or some kind of, oh, you're burning only carbs and now you need to change this so you can burn fats or whatever, right? There's the breath mod. All of those will change depending on the environment. So those become tests that get really messy really quick and don't give you any information because you don't know the environment, right? So that's
Uh,
why I put
they also seem like they don't even give you a solution, because solution for every single test result is just start eating like an adult.
Yeah,
Always, always.
yeah, exactly. Most of those tests, the final verdict is just eat whole food and be an adult and you'll be
Yeah.
fine, right? So
And
more
what I mean
important,
by that is not kale and celery juice. It's actually eating variety of food, which a lot of people
yeah.
don't. Just because you drink
We'll get
celery
into
juice every single day doesn't mean you're healthy.
correct, correct. And we'll get into the details of what I mean by that, right? So instead, what I would prefer, right, you get some blood testing, we'll go through the details of that. Then you get some actual environmental testing. Number one is the water that you drink, right? What's
Mm.
in that water, right? Because you're mainly made of water, and your food that you're going to be eating, irrelevant of what it is going to be dictated, like the interactions, the way it gets digested, the way it gets assimilated into the body. It's going to be carried by water, right? So if your water
So
has a bunch of
let me just interrupt you. So somebody in Toronto can't do a blood test, can't do whatever test. He flies into New York because it's easier in America. They do the test there, then they fly back and they get interpreted. You can't do this, you can't do that, and you're like, I've never done it. It will be because they were in New York eating certain food, drinking certain water, and now their food intolerance test comes back completely irrelevant, right?
correct. Yeah, that's exactly how a food intolerance test would work. Is the fact that it's in a different environment, right? Wherever you went to do the test, then your environment where you eat your food will change the outcome of the food intolerance, literally. Right? So
Well, it goes back
then,
to the traveling video we made a few weeks ago, where you were talking like
yes.
you know the difference. Uh,
Mhm.
the,
Yeah,
the
yeah,
best
exactly.
example is super heavyweight bodybuilders, because they eat so much food and they usually, oh, when I go to Europe, I eat food, I feel much better. Like, yeah, because you usually get foods that's locally made, not
Yeah,
imported.
yeah, because that's just, yeah, exactly. Whereas in America, it's all conglomerated, right? It's all coming from
Right.
centralized facilities and stuff like that. Even the meat, right? Unless are lucky like me, where you actually know the rancher down the street and you can buy the meat directly from them. most people, if I go, just 20 minutes away to a Walmart or a Smith's or whatever, and I buy the meat from there, that's conglomerate meat. That means that the
Mm,
meat sources are coming from everywhere in America and probably outside of America, and they're being all packaged together, especially if you're getting ground beef. So yes, that matters, right? And so what I'd rather you see, if you're going to spend extra money, besides a blood test of the details that we'll discuss in a moment, is and let's know something about your environment, where you live, what you actually interact with. The water that you drink is probably one of the more important ones. How much fluoride is it? Is there a lot of chloride in it? Because those are going to upset how you digest food and how you react to food, right?
mm,
So if you tell me, hey, my water is fluorinated, chlorinated, and I'm having a whole bunch of stomach problems, the first thing I'm going to have you do is probably stop drinking that water, right?
mm.
Don't drink that water for maybe a week or two and see if things just resolve, because those are harmful chemicals in large quantities, right? If you're trying to stay hydrated, you're going to drink a lot of it. You're going to inadvertently react differently when you remove that, right? So that's number one of like figuring out the environment. What does your water look like? Number two, if you have the money to spend, then and you don't even really need money to spend. You can, like I discussed in the travel video, there's websites out there that tell you, how many how many cell phone towers are around you and that sort of stuff. But that's the type of things that we want to know, right? Lighting circumstances and things of that nature, right? Are you surrounded by buildings that have 24-hour light shining on your building, right? That matters. That means that,
Mm.
hey, maybe what you should invest in is some blackout curtains and ways to mitigate that internally and stuff like that, right? Some of this testing of the environment is literally free. I'm just going to ask you questions about your environment, right? What's the lighting in and around your house? What's the lighting, a little bit further out from a block? Do you live close to hospitals? Do you live close to cell phone towers? So most of this is for free information, but it paints a picture of your environment, right? And then you give me like one test of like your water that you're consuming. Then you tell me your environment, your water, and you give me a blood test. I can tell you exactly what you should and shouldn't eat, because I will know that environment and how it interacts with your body, and we can see the interactions in your blood, right? And so then you go, oh, there's a little bit more, too much inflammation going on. Let's eat a little bit more carnivore-esque, right? A little bit more meat, a little bit more fat, a little less carbs, especially like high fruit and rice type carbs. And next thing you know, they start having less inflammation. That's going to be reflected without testing anything, because you're going to see it in their face. You're going to see it in their stomach. You're going to see it in places where retention happens, right? So immediately you can you can map out a path by looking at these two things. And then you start making the changes, and then you can start looking at their biofeedback of how they look and how they feel and stuff like that. And you can see if you're pushing in the right direction or not. Most of the time, that's exactly how it works out. But I need those inputs, right? I can't look at a blood test and do that. I need a blood test and a little bit about your environment. I certainly can't dictate any of that by a food intolerance test. A food intolerance test, because of what you stated earlier, tells me nothing and tells me that whatever you tested will change. That's all that it
Yeah,
really tells
absolutely. And bringing it back to the stuff that just enough is never enough. Some people do, like women specifically. Well, why should I do testosterone test? I'm like, why wouldn't you want to know if your sex drive is healthy? Like, well,
me. Right.
what's wrong
Right.
about that?
So yeah, I think right now is the appropriate time. I'll share my screen of a blood test, a complete blood test of what the basics should be, right? So that we can tell everything about it, right? This is a very important part. I don't care if you're a man or a female, it should always start with this type of stuff, right? So at the very beginning, we have the stuff that people will be familiar with, right? Your glucose, your BUN, your electrolytes, right? That's great, because that starts to tell us about water networks. It starts to tell us about specifically the BUN, right? BUN stands for blood urea nitrogen. Nitrogen only comes from protein. When you have a lot of BUN in the blood, you're excreting a lot of misfolded proteins. That could be a couple reasons for that, right? Training hard and eating lots of protein will exaggerate that. That's why I need to know your environment, your personal inputs, right? And the other thing that it tells us is if you have like a normal lifestyle, right? You train somewhat normally or don't train at all, and you're eating, somewhat normal amount of protein, and this number is high, what it really tells us is you're chronically functioning in a dehydrated state because folding proteins requires proper hydration at the mitochondrial level, which is where proteins get folded. So if that's high, it tells us that your water networks, the mitochondrial water that's being produced in your body, which should be deuterium depleted, is not being produced at the high enough level to keep that in the right range. So immediately it tells me a lot about mitochondria. It tells me a lot about hydration. Then we come down here and look at calcium. Calcium at the upper end of the range, somewhere close to 10, starts to tells us that there's a large need for calcium for the cells, for the calcium cell stress response. It tells me you're stressed at the cellular level, right? So if that's normal, great, you're not stressed at the cellular level. If it's higher, if we start seeing the trend go higher, it tells me you're putting on way more stress. Then we can start to talk about, is there more stress, right? Are you actually more stressed out because of work? Or are you more, training harder? Or it's like, hey, both of those are normal, but somehow this number is going up. Well, that starts to tell me that it's more of an electromagnetic field or something you can't see that's interacting with you at the cellular level, right? So that's that's the importance. Those
And
are
before
the
you even go forward, these are tests which almost 100% will not be asked by your GP to be done.
No, no, they won't, right? Even though these are basics, right? These are basic stuff, right? Electrolytes, this tells me about what's going on in your blood. What is your blood carrying around, right? And more importantly, right? Like sodium, for example, some people don't salt any of their food, and their sodium is, and they're drinking a ton of
Yeah, it's
water, and they
crazy. People are still terrified of sodium.
yeah. And so this tells us right there of whether that's, your behavior around that is good or bad, right? Sometimes it's fine, sometimes it's not, right? And this is basic stuff. This starts to tell me what you should be consuming, what you shouldn't be consuming, right? If your potassium is super, super low and your sodium is really high, it tells me you don't eat vegetables. That's literally what it tells me. It tells me you're not consuming any kind of potassium, but you're not getting it from places, right? That's going to be coming from whole food sources, and you're not doing that, right? It's not in processed foods. So this is a very valuable thing to start to decipher what you should and shouldn't be putting in your body. And it starts to tell us about whether your body is stressed, whether your body is dehydrated. This is a very basic test. It's called a CMP, right? Then we go down. We go down, and these are values that most people will get, which is cholesterol values and stuff like that, right? Now, the cholesterol values, I don't tie those to heart health. They're not heart health. They are sex hormone preparatory molecules, specifically prohormone vitamin D and DHEA and pregnenolone, which then turn into estrogen, testosterone, and cortisol, right? So if your LDL, for example, is high, it starts telling me, oh, you know what? We should look at the downstream effects of LDL. That's the main cholesterol molecule that's going to be sulfated into all the prohormones, starting with vitamin D. So if we see LDL is high, and we go down and check your vitamin D, right? We're somewhere in here, right here, vitamin D. Look at this, 23. It's low, right? What does that tell me? It tells me you don't get enough sun to sulfate that LDL cholesterol to start the process of making vitamin D and all your sex hormones. That's what it tells me, right? So it starts to tell me about light behavior. It starts to tell me about your interactions with UV light specifically, right? So then I can make more precise recommendations of what you should and shouldn't be doing, what time of day you should be getting out and maxing out that time, and all of that sort of stuff, right? It also tells us about DHEA, the combination of knowing your DHEA and your cortisol starts to tell us how long you've been stressed, right? So if I determine that you're actually under a lot of stress, we can go to your DHEA and your cortisol and look at them. Hey, is your DHEA actually at the low end of the range? That means it's being depleted very quickly, and your cortisol is still normal. That means we've caught it early enough that you're not suffering from adrenal fatigue yet, but you're probably going to, because if DHEA continues to drop, then your cortisol will drop, and then your stress handling capability is shot, right?
And
And so
again,
it starts
before
to
you continue, this is again tests that is rarely done. Even more advanced tests don't specifically ask, uh, don't include this, uh, just because they don't understand the importance of it.
Yes, and before we move on, specifically with cortisol and insulin, right? You notice over here, there's a AM and a PM, right? Now, The time of day that you take a test when you're doing a full blood test like this, when you're getting cortisol and insulin sensitivity and stuff like that, the time of day matters a lot. You should be fasted, you should be well hydrated, and you should do it in the morning, the first 3 hours of the
And I think a great addition would be fasted means no coffee.
right, exactly, right? Because coffee is going to influence cortisol response. It's going to influence a bunch of things, right? It just means water, right? Water and some electrolytes is what it means. Be hydrated well, as if you're going to be, getting on a plane. That means don't get excited. Don't stimulate yourself, right?
Yeah.
And be
It's like
hydrated.
I usually take my own samples and I know I can because I'm very calm about it. But if someone
Mhm.
else would do it, they would completely skew their readings up. So the cortisol and
Yeah.
testosterone would be completely messed up just because stress managing
Mhm.
capabilities are not
Mhm.
there, right?
Yeah, exactly. So that's the point is you should be very calm. You should be well hydrated so that whoever's drawing your blood can draw it very easily and you can, make your veins pop very easily. And so there are circumstances for the blood test to make sure that you're getting the right results, which is take it in the morning, take it fasted, well hydrated with only water and some electrolytes. That's all that should be going into your body.
And
Good.
what you just mentioned as well, probably don't drive to blood testing clinic while swearing at somebody on a phone.
Correct, right? Yeah, exactly, right? You want to be in a very calm state, just your natural, whatever you feel like your
Mm.
natural behavior is, your natural state of emotional state is in the morning. That's what it should be, right? And so then the next thing that tells us very clearly inflammatory responses is high sensitivity C-reactive protein. Now they classify it as cardiac, and for the most part, it's relative to that. But what it basically means is that there is inflammation in your blood, in your blood vessels, right? Does that mean that your heart is inflamed? No, it just means that you are carrying inflammation in your circulatory system. And that's a key
Tell me
thing,
one
right?
thing. So when this marker is slightly off, is it more dangerous when your LDL is off by a mile, or is it less dangerous if your cholesterol is in check?
Uh, it is less dangerous just from the let's back up a little bit because you have to quantify a little bit. If I determine that your sex hormones, your vitamin D are super, super squashed, and it basically tells me that this has been going on for years, then I would say the C-reactive protein tells us that this is a bigger problem, right? Now, if
Mm,
your sex hormones, your vitamin D and everything are maybe a little bit deficient, but not crazy out of whack, then I would put less weight on how dangerous this is,
mm.
right? Because it's about time. How long has this been going on? And here's the caveat with the C-reactive protein. The reason why I say it says cardiac, but it basically just means inflammation in the cardiovascular system. If you were sick the week before you got the blood test, this will be elevated because you're
Mm.
still getting the inflammation.
Again, this seems like never a good idea to have it elevated. But if it is
Correct.
elevated, don't get alarmed if you just overcame an illness and make sure you double check it maybe a couple of weeks later on just to be sure, because it doesn't sound like something that you can give a pass like LDL if your HDL is in check and everything else that you could kind of overlook slightly. But this one is probably not one you should be ignoring, right?
Correct. Yeah. If it comes back elevated, especially if you're getting like a crazy number, like a 7 or a 10 or something like that, when it's the high sensitivity version, then I would say the first thing when I see somebody with a high number like that, the first thing I ask them is, were you sick at any point in time before or after the test? And if the answer is yes, then I don't worry about it. I just have them retest just that marker. Now, if they tell me, like this particular sample says 1.6, that's average, right? That's if you look at the right here, it says between 1 and 3 is average. What does that mean? That means you have the average risk of every American. What does that mean? That means that 1 in 3 in every 5 people are going to have a cardiovascular event. That's average, right?
That's not
So
very good.
it's not very good, exactly. So that's what it. So there's nothing wrong with you. You haven't been
Uh,
sick, right? And this is what comes back. And then I see a vitamin D of 23, and I see a cortisol that's floating towards like 10. Then it starts to tell me, oh, this has probably been going on for a little while. We need to fix this, right? So this then becomes a marker that we do follow and put a lot more weight on. right?
Yeah.
Now we'll come down a little bit down to insulin, right? This person's insulin was a 9.2. And if we go up here, it doesn't say, but normally it will tell you fasted, and it tells you the time of day it was collected, right? So if it was in the morning and you were fasted with an insulin level of a 9, it tells me your insulin sensitivity is not very good. It tells me that that number should be like a 4 or a 3 or less, right? Even if you have really high insulin sensitivity. So it starts to tell me acutely, this doesn't mean diabetes, or even pre-diabetes. This is before pre-diabetes. This is insulin sensitivity. And it changes depending on the seasons and what you're eating, right? So if if your insulin value going into the fall starts to climb, right, you get a test in the fall versus a test in the summer, and your insulin is dramatically different, then I can go, oh, what are you eating? Let's start changing that. That's what's actually going to drive this acute insulin sensitivity or insensitivity. And then ferritin is a big one, right? Ferritin, right? And basically this has to be coupled with iron, right? So we go back up to red blood cells, white blood cells, all of this type of stuff. If your red blood cells are going through the roof and iron is nice and high, your body is attempting to deliver more oxygen to your body, right? That's what it's telling you, right? If your red blood cells are high, iron is high, those are all the things that carry oxygen to the body. And then we go down and look at ferritin, and it's low, even though those are high. What does that tell me? It tells me about the oxidation state of iron. A lot of people don't know this. Some doctors don't even know this, which I can't believe. Iron is paramagnetic. What does that mean? That means depending on electrical signaling, aka sunlight or lack of sunlight or other electromagnetic fields, it will be turned into +3, which means it can't carry oxygen, or it'll be +2, which means it can carry oxygen. You don't really have to know those because there's two tests. Ferritin, which is very easily gotten, and that carries the +2 version, right? That +2 version carries oxygen, right? So if you have high iron, high red blood cells, and your ferritin is low, that means you're not carrying oxygen because it's not carrying the +2. And if you were to get a second test, which is a transferritin, that carries the +3 version. The +3 version doesn't carry oxygen. So what you'll see when ferritin is low, red blood cells are high, iron is high, you'll see transferritin very high. And that means it's carrying most of the hemoglobin in the body, the iron in the body, in the +3 state, incapable of carrying oxygen. So you're being hypoxic, even though you're have plenty of iron or oxygen carrying capabilities. Does that make sense?
It makes a lot of sense, and it makes a lot of sense in ability of understanding more about environment the person is in without even asking them.
Yes.
So you kind of like, okay, there is a thing, and a lot of people are in denial how much actually environment is affecting them positively or negatively. You know,
Yeah.
we talk about it many, many times that people, you mention light and they go like, it's nonsense. And then they believe in Bluetooth, Wi-Fi, radio, TV, and everything. I'm like, well, if it's nonsense, then none of this technology would be available.
Exactly, right? Exactly, right? Wi-Fi wouldn't work without light, the appropriate amount of light. It just wouldn't. It's not a thing that would like it just wouldn't function right when you fundamentally understand that.
Yeah, and
Let's see.
it's oblivious kind of notion that, hey, none of these things will affect me, and what are you talking about 5G and 4G? But you can directly feel it.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. So, and that's pretty much it, right? I'm not going to go into further details, but you see how fundamentally, if you get all of this blood work, you can tell about insulin sensitivity. You can you can look at thyroid function. Actually, that's the last one, right, that I wanted to look at real quick. I just wanted to double check that I wasn't going to run out of time.
And I think whilst you're opening it up, important notion as well to kind of mention there is what season of the year is that? Because that
Correct.
insulin might be the highest because it's beginning of the year or late winter or something like that, when they need to be slightly insulin resistant, right?
Yeah, especially depending on what they're eating. That's what I'm saying. If the insulin resistance is too high and it's December, right, I'm like, oh, okay, well, let's stop eating a bunch of rice and bread and start eating a little bit more tubers, things that digest a little. You see what I mean? You once you start to understand how these interact, You can really dial somebody in
Mm.
just by looking at this and knowing their environment. And now we'll look at this one because the women get absolutely taken here, right? Your TSH tells you nothing about your thyroid. It is called thyroid stimulating hormone. It just tells us how much output your brain is telling your thyroid gland to put out. That doesn't tell you anything about the output. The output comes in two flavors, free T4, which is usually located up here a little ways. Right here, free T4, right? And that tells me about nighttime behavior because free T4 only gets made at night. So it tells me a lot about your light environment at night because it only gets created when there is a large melatonin response. So it tells me about how late you stay up. That's what it tells me, right? So if free T4 is really shot, it tells me your nighttime behavior is where we need to focus. And then that gets converted to free T3, which is active, right? And that's what's going to govern your metabolism. And that only happens in the morning. So if your free T4 is normal, but your free T3 is tanked, it tells me that you have a morning problem. Right? It tells me that you're not interacting with sunlight or getting the appropriate signaling, whether it's cold or sunlight, to initiate that cascade of converting T4 into T3 in the morning, because it only happens in the morning because it's active. If it were to happen at any other point in time, it will keep you awake. Right. And that might happen depending on your behavior, right? If you're somebody who works night shift, for example, you'll start to see this trend change because of how they interact with light, because light is what governs the activation of this process, right? So you must have free T4 and free T3. I could care less about TSH.
And again, what you just highlighted is that data without context means nothing because you can see, look at this and say, oh, you completely messed up. You need thyroid support, this and that. And then they go, oh, I work a night shift. And you're like, okay, none of this makes sense now. Don't listen to what I
Yeah,
just said. Let's flip it over. Okay. Right.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, 100%, right? That's what I'm saying. You
And
need
that's
to know.
distinctions that doctors never make. They never ask you anything.
No, they ask you that they exactly. They never ask you anything. You step in, they put you on a scale, they measure your height, they take your age, right? Your date of birth, and that's it. So they know how old you are, they know what you weigh, and know your height, and then they just tell you a whole bunch of things without asking what lifestyle you live, when you get outside, when you don't get outside, what do you do at night, what time of day do you work? They don't ask you any of that. How could they ever recommend anything if they don't know, though, that, with the framework that we just put out in the very beginning of this video? You must know the internal environment, which they are getting that. But then to interpret it, you must know the external environment. If you don't know that, don't even bother because you're gonna have a 50% strike rate, right? You might as well flip a coin as far as like what to do.
It brings me to this, like, oh, fasting increases your growth hormone and that increases your testosterone. And I'm like, yeah, at that point of the day, but what does it actually do to your body? Means nothing. It's just a response that you were starving your body.
Yeah, yeah, it's just reacting to what you did, right? And that then once you understand that, then you can start dictating things to do, right? The biggest thing that the takeaway from this is yes, sometimes a supplement will help some of this stuff. Sometimes a peptide or a hormone will help some of this stuff. But often it's a combination of there might be one or two of these things and a lot of work. You must do some work, right?
Mm.
Whether that's changing your lifestyle or doing a certain activity at a certain time of the day. And sometimes the work isn't actually work. It means, hey, I'm going to take a lunch break. I'm going to go outside and I'm going to take my shirt off at the park and eat my lunch. Sometimes that's the best solution,
Yeah,
which isn't,
and you kind of covered that in our previous video about longevity, like hacks. You gave specific hacks that people can do to improve your health. And this is kind of tying into that. If you do all that stuff, uh, just make sure that when you do your MOT or checkup or whatever you want to name it, that you are thorough enough, but not overcomplicated to the point where it puts you off from being healthy.
yeah, yeah. And that's why I wanted to focus It's an internal environment and an external environment. Any test that's trying to interpret the interaction between the two is exactly that. It's only an interpretation, and all the things, whether it's political or whether it's that, every person will have their own interpretation. I'm not about that. I'm about what is going to happen if I introduce this particular modality or this particular food to this person in this environment, right? That
And
is how
would
you should.
it be far-fetched to do something that me and you do thorough blood tests, and then give a feedback when the blood test was taken, how you were feeling, what you were doing, what you were eating, where you were living, to collect data for yourself. So every single time you go back to your professional and you can go give them feedback, hey, this is what was happening before. And now you almost develop a behavior where you can predict how you're going to feel, not just based on your blood test, but based on your habits.
Yeah, yeah, that's all the people that I coach, all the people that do any blood consultation. There's an intake form that asks these specific questions, right? That asks you, when do you wake up? When do you go to sleep? What do you eat? How often do you eat? What time of day do you stop eating? What time of day do you start eating? It asks you all of this stuff. And coincidentally, in the blood test, it also happens to have your home address. So then I go look at your home address, look at the environment that you're in. And now with the blood test and the environment that you're in and the questions you've answered, I've gotten 90% of the information that I need to really start dialing you in, right? Or at least put you in the right direction.
Yeah. Awesome, David. Appreciate you as always. I know I need to let you off, and see you in next videos.
Awesome, man. Thank you.